felt like it was your final.
I know. You go.
I mean, I was debating about, I did the essay exam because Thomas and I spent some time talking about it, and he said he wanted to do the essay exam. And again, in the future, I think he'll probably be teaching this class maybe twice. I don't know what they have set up. Thomas Schwartzer, he's the person who's teaching it on Saturdays. But anyway, part of me is wondering if a multiple choice exam would have worked out better.
That's what I
I don't know, but at least you would have had all the answers in front of you at the multiple choice exam, which I think probably would have been a little bit easier. But it's all right. I made it work.
Randomly, like.
So.
I was like, no, sorry, no.
Um,
Well, I said no, because I'm like.
should I start with the 6 of you that are actually here?
Yes, that's what.
I just don't.
All right.
Oh, no.
Oh no. You don't want me? You don't want me to start? What? I don't know where everybody is. I mean, for the record, what, we have 6 people here. It's 6:25.
Oh, it's 25 today?
What?
How many people? Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, it's 6:25. Normally there's 12 people in the class.
Yeah.
Or no, 13. 13. So I don't know where everybody is.
Who got this without?
I haven't gotten any emails. But anyway, so for tonight, here's what we're going to do. Actually, here's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to briefly go over the essay exams. I'm going to turn on a little pointer thing so it actually works when I click on buttons. Power works well with it. Talk about housing, basics and trends, and this is all based on Chapter 9 from the Lynch book, because he spends a whole chapter talking about housing. And then Chapter 12, or no, sorry, Chapter 10, he talks about all these other things. So I'll spend some time talking about housing, different types of housing types related to single family, multifamily, and then we'll talk about the other aspects. In terms of retail, industrial, institutional. And industrial, how many of you are excited about industrial real estate development? Exactly, but with the expansion of the Panama Canal and with all the investments that they've been making to the Port of Miami, Port Everglades, all the way up the East Coast and the Gulf Coast to be able to accommodate these huge tankers. And the first one just arrived at Miami the other day. So when I get to that point in the lecture, I'm going to actually play a clip for you because they had this, I mean, the mayor was there, somebody from Panama was there, and they talk about this boat and they show you the improvements of how much freight they can now bring into the port.
So they have to do dredging?
Yeah, so they completely expanded the Panama Canal. I think it was a 10 to 15 year project. And it was just completed about a month ago. So these first super tankers are starting to come through. And again, yeah, it's a huge amount of income. And so things like all aboard Florida, technically it's passenger rail, but they're going to be able to accommodate a ton of freight now too, and they're going to be able to move that freight a lot quicker than they used to be able to move it. So rather than moving 30 to 40 miles per hour, with these new tracks, they can move that freight at about 75 miles per hour, 60 to 75.
That's what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's the thing is they're just going to run it all up the coast. So because of that, you're going to see as long as the economy is going well, cranking along, they're going to be able to accommodate a lot more in terms of goods either coming in or goods coming out. So you have all these port things, but the problem is that once things get to the port, you have to build things like warehousing, storage facilities, and a variety of other things that might be able to accommodate all this additional freight. Because you might not be able to move it all at once, because we're talking about a lot more than they used to be able to bring.
Is there a lot of cold storage on the port, man?
They're talking about doing a lot more of it. Because again, a lot of, not even seafood, but just everything, all kinds of food that's coming through. And then also you have some high-tech stuff. So you're not really talking about cold storage, but it does have to be climate control. And that's for more specialized type of things. So what you're seeing is with all the development going on in Miami, you're starting to see like multifamily and industrial sort of butting heads in terms of available space. And most people don't want to live right next to a port facility, but then again, it's right on the ocean. So it's like, what are you going to do? So I'll talk about that, and then second half of the class I'll turn over to all of you to play with Legos, work on your projects, basically whoever's left, because right now we only have 2 groups represented. And of those 2 groups, each one of those groups only has 60% of their people. So we'll see. And of those 60%, 1 in 3 of them doesn't seem to sound very good right now, based on everything that I've heard. So I'm just going to try to breathe through my nose and not touch anything. Yeah, they're interesting. Try some. So moving along, in terms of the essay exams, right, so part of the reason why I sent out that announcement was because I was told that there may or may not be a prospective student in this class tonight. And so, as far as I can tell, there's no prospective student. So I can sort of talk a little bit, but basically, when you got the gist of it from my announcement, in terms of some of you forgot to discuss things. So I mean, it was an essay exam. What I wanted to know a little bit more was more about, do you understand the process? So in other words, when I said discuss, I was looking for more than essentially just a list of things. But do you know what you're talking about, or do you just know a couple of words? And in some cases, I don't think it was necessarily anybody here right now, but there were just like pages and pages of stuff that talked like all around the point. In other words, it was the type of person where I would never ask them for directions, because rather than just say, take this road for about a mile, they'd have me going on all the side streets forever. And I might not necessarily have time for that. So, this slide goes through 10 basic things for each question. Very simple, straightforward.
Did we get to keep these?
Oh yeah, because yeah, they were, like my dog was wondering what that awful smell was in my briefcase. And I was like, yeah, I'm just so, and again, this is very basic. It's not every single little thing. Because if I ever teach this class again, I'll probably use something similar to these questions, maybe, but I'll probably just go multiple choice. Because again, I think that would have been the better route to take. In hindsight, I haven't taught this class before, so I figured, hey, let's see how this essay exam goes. Because the other thing is that it's much easier to write an essay exam than it is a multiple choice exam.
Process of elimination.
Right. So the first 2 questions pretty much were things throughout the first 8 chapters. Basically, it was more or less checking to see if you had read the book in terms of the site planning questions and discussing them to see if you picked up on anything related to the actual process of site planning. The third question, essentially, you had to pick 4 of these 7. And for the most part, some of you talked about 4 things. A couple of you actually listed all 7, which was cool. I only needed 4. But some of you talked about things that I sort of tied into one of these, even if it wasn't directly using these terms. So in other words, I tried my best to give points wherever I could without getting into some sort of crisis of conscience over how far do I go to do that.
Wait, question. What's the, is that the page number?
Oh, sorry, these are page numbers.
Okay.
So basically, when I came up with the essay exam, I sat there with my book open and just sort of flipped through and picked stuff. But, excuse me, I got like some of the sesame seeds in my throat. But, might have poisoned myself. No. But these were also, every single one of those questions, I spent some points of some lectures actually discussing. So in other words, it might have seemed like it kind of came out of thin air, but to some extent, like the question on slopes, I think I spent 20 minutes talking about all the different ways you can use different slopes on the site. So you might see and say, okay, we can't do anything with this, but there are some things you can do that are essentially become more passive as your slope increases. But I'll get to that. 28 through 29 does 4 things about land suitability: adequate size, appropriate shape, climate in terms of landscaping that it can support, And is the slope suitable? In terms of 5:29 to 32, this had to do with something. Hang on. Yeah, and unfortunately, so I brought one copy of the questions. All of your essay questions that some of you had written on, they all fell out. So in other words, they're somewhere in my house. I do know that, but I also took them all out when I was grading, because when I was grading, literally, let's say 7 of you answered the same question, I opened up your blue books to that question and had them all laid out on a table in front of me, and I read all of them. And that was after I had already given grades, and I was like, those are really low. Let's see what we can do here. So the 5th question dealt with 3 of the 4 factors related to determining the suitability of density. And so that was situational in terms of the site itself and what you're trying to do with it, allowable costs, who you're serving in terms of the demographics or the general market, and the character of the surrounding development. So 6, I already touched on the whole slope question, but there's a lot of time, or a lot of areas in other chapters beyond 28 and 29 where they talk about the importance of slope. And again, slope does have an impact because sometimes you can't just fill the land in and make it all level. So from a site planning standpoint, understanding how you can use the slope that you have or what you can do with the slope that you have is important, because even if you just say we can't do anything now that's turned into a park, that park can still add value to the overall site. The 7th question was essentially plant related. This is where I had the 2 statements. And I'll be honest, you guys really like having those 2 statements because you're like, hey, I think most of the class answered that question.
Number 7.
The 8th question about superblocks, I spent some time talking about that. And actually that picture came straight from the book that was in that question. And it was basically, some of you defined it mostly well, some of you defined it really well, some of you almost had like the textbook definition of it. I know part of that is just some people can recall things better, but to some extent you are in different planes in terms of how that question was answered. And so it's hard to say, okay.
What was the question again itself?
Oh, the question itself was, define superblocks and discuss advantages and disadvantages of superblocks. And then I talked about how I highlighted the Brickell development as a slightly comparable example of a superblock. And then the picture below is Baldwin Hills, which Lynch discusses in the book. And so superblocks, they were discussed more or less from 44 to 47, and it was talked about sort of doing dense development in urban areas, but doing things with the streets so that you don't have a bunch of people driving through those neighborhoods. So if you make curvy streets, we make a lot of intersections with stop signs, people will stay on those main streets to the periphery, and they won't bother trying to cut through that neighborhood. But then the other issue you have is that if it's walkable, you have to deal with things like how do you police it, and do you have adequate lighting, and a variety of other issues. Because in South Florida, we know that a lot of times parks can be really nice, but if you have a park, you can always prevent who uses that park. So 9, this had to do with 3 ways to reduce costs in relation to the cost of circulation. So not just the general cost related to development, but in terms of circulation, he mentions minimizing street length, because that's one way you can more or less maximize your developable space. The other thing was having specialized street types, whether it's cul-de-sacs or something else along those lines. And then the 3rd thing is having gentle gradients and curves. So the more you put curves into a development, the more those curves cut into the amount of developable land that you have. And so you start ending up with more and more land that you can't really use. So if you can turn that other land into things like small parks or something along those lines, that's great. But if you can't, then you're more or less stuck with it.
I'm sorry, what was the question for number 9?
Number 9 was, you are tasked with site planning a large tract of land. How would you reduce the cost of circulation? There were 3 specific things mentioned in Lynch. discuss how each of these three things can reduce costs. And then the 10th thing comes from when Lynch is talking about social and aesthetic impacts of circulation on pages 50 to 52. And in that regard, he talks about a variety of things that you can more or less create a neighborhood, but at the same time, bless you. But at the same time, are these people too close to one another? And a couple of other things in there where they all touched on Chatham Village, which was also the same development from the book. In terms of stuff. I lost my train of thought, sorry. But basically the idea was it wasn't a very expensive development. They were all townhomes. They were compact. People liked it because it was a sense of neighborhood that they didn't have elsewhere in, I think it was in Pittsburgh. So it was this development, the idea was you do dense development in an urban area and not have it be extremely expensive and not have, basically make it affordable, but also create this sense of place in a neighborhood in an urban area where none previously existed.
Is that what you consider the benefits to be? What did you consider the benefits to be?
Well, the benefits are creating a neighborhood where otherwise there was none.
Okay.
I can't remember the other stuff exactly from the book. I think I see the rest. Were those people in our class? Maybe not. Must be another class. That's all right. So, any questions on that? Who else is here?
And each question, up to how many points could you have gotten?
25. Yeah, so just grade them all evenly. And again, the first 7 were sort of broader, big picture stuff. And the second set was more specific, sort of related to some things that stood out from the book that were relevant. At least that I thought were relevant, even if you might disagree. All right, so now we got that out of the way. We're going to talk about what I really want to talk about.
Yes.
You all right? Just want to get closer to me. It happens. I'm just. It's all right. She's yours, I respect that. I mean, you're each other's. My bad. How many of you know who Frida is? I'm going to show you this real quickly.
The dancer?
That's big for me.
Oh.
I was waiting.
So, I don't know if you've heard of Frida or not, but in terms of finding data related to Florida, Florida-specific data, it stands for the Florida Research and Economic Information Database Application. So you can get things like labor market data by industry occupation. So you can look at things like, they have projections for the next 10 years of where there's going to be job growth in Florida, or where they think there's going to be job growth in Florida. Most of it's like, well, actually, where do you think there's going to be a lot of growth in Florida? Some of this you don't need data for. So health, definitely, based on the...
Career, right? You're talking about career or location?
I'm talking about careers, sorry, occupations. So a lot of development, or a lot of additional jobs in health, whether it's home health industries, other types of health-related,
Retail.
right?
I think
Service industry in terms of
services.
retail, restaurants, all that other stuff. All right, so you have that. you've got a whole bunch of different products that they offer. They have unemployment rates on a monthly basis. They also have presentations. And so some of these will be very specific. They do like a monthly state of the economy type of thing. And they also have GIS charts and library.
Now, is this the basic site? I mean, they have a subscription.
No, this is state. This is all free from the state. So, and I'm just showing you this because it could be useful for other things that you do in your other classes, but I'm trying to find employment projections. I'm just going to pull this up. Now, this doesn't touch directly on the lecture, but the reason why I'm showing you this is because when you think about things like occupation, job growth, that's what drives real estate development. Because depending on the types of jobs, that gives you an idea for what real estate can support the incomes that are affiliated with those jobs. What's up with that? So maybe not. But I'll put this link online, because hopefully on your computers, because sometimes there are,
Yeah, you can. There you go.
why did it take so long? It's like a one-page Excel spreadsheet. See, that's just, yeah, so it's just slow. But anyway, so eventually, someday, at some point, I might have to come back to this later in the lecture because it's, I mean, 27%, it's not increasing at all. I don't really know what's up, but it'll show you very specific occupations for the entire county projected out to 2023. So, and again, they're projections, so you have to sort of take it with a grain of salt, but those projections are based on trends of what they think is going to be happening. And again, based on that, if you see that there's going to be a whole lot of growth in retail, what's that tell you, or what impact might that have on the real estate development types that you would want to do? Because I don't know how much more retail we can support. And I was reading a couple articles about they're starting to shelve some high-end condominium developments in Miami because the US dollar is strong, which is sort of good because that means we can buy more stuff with it. But it's bad because most of those condos being bought in Miami were all being bought internationally. So now that the dollar's stronger, that means that their money's worth less, which means that they can't afford a lot of the stuff that's being built. Wait, we'll come back to that later because it is not cooperating. But I'll put this link on the Blackboard page so you can see, sort of mess around with it, because it also has general economic trends throughout Florida. They'll do special things every now and then, like they'll talk about the state of Florida's aging population, where they'll talk about, a couple years ago they were talking about foreclosure and the impact on local economies. So all of you should be sort of relatively familiar with this in terms of when it comes to growth, any type of growth has an impact on real estate. So if you have more people moving somewhere, they need places to live. Ideally they're moving there because there are jobs available. Depending on those jobs, that enables them to do certain things. I talked a little bit about how we're having this expansion of the Panama Canal. And because of that expansion, the Port of Miami and Port Everglades, they can accommodate, based on upgrades that they've made to their ports, they can accommodate these much larger ships. So you have a lot more industrial stuff moving in, which means that there's more demand for industrial space now because you can accommodate these much larger ships. And assuming that you can't move freight as quickly as you can bring stuff in, it has to sit somewhere. So the need for warehousing space is important. And then, are you familiar with the difference between basic and non-basic employment? So basic employment, that's what drives an economy. The most important jobs, that if those jobs left, it would have an impact that would trickle throughout the rest of the economy. So in other words, traditionally, basic jobs were seen as the big factory or the big headquarters in a downtown area that occupied a lot of office space. So those basic jobs drove the economy. And then everything else would more or less be supportive of those jobs. So you'd have this primary job driver, then you have the secondary stuff. So a lot of times they use the old, from an industrial standpoint, things like auto manufacturing in the Midwest. Where you'd have the cars built, but then you have the stamping plants for all the parts, you have the auto parts plants, you'd have things like tires, all those other things were all made. So you had the car, and the auto industry drove it, but then everything that goes into making the car was also all around. So that drove all those jobs. And you can see that once that economy moved overseas, it caused most of those economies to tank. So those would be your basic jobs. The non-basic jobs would be things like retail, entertainment, what we have a ton of in Florida, because we've got this tourist-based economy to some extent. So it's a little bit problematic, because if we have a recession, which you saw a couple of years ago, that pretty much dried up the economy at a much faster rate than other areas that have more diversified economies. So some issues with housing. In any given year, 20% of people move or move on or move up. Everybody got it?
Yeah.
In Florida, you probably get an equal amount of move on, or move up. So some people pass away. That's moving on. Could be moving on elsewhere geographically also. And because of that, sometimes it's very difficult to figure out who to plan for. And a lot of that just has to do with time and timing. There's the concept of filtering. So think about where you might have lived 10 years ago. Hopefully you live somewhere better 10 years later. And the idea is that as things improve in your life situation, your income, or whatever else the case might be, you start a family and you need more space. The idea is that you go from wherever you used to live to something better. And ideally, the concept is that everybody filters up. So in other words, like when I was going to grad school at Ohio State, I had about 400 square feet. It was in a very unpleasant area of Columbus. And since then, things have gotten a little bit better. So I went from that 400 square foot apartment that had like an 8 square foot linoleum section in the living room with a kitchen. Well, that was the kitchen. So you had the refrigerator, stove, microwave, dishwasher, all that stuff was just like right there. But now it's spread out a little bit. Those things are still right there, but they're a little bit nicer. There's a little bit more space. And I don't feel bad having people over. Whereas there, anyway, so what I'm saying is that things change over time. And the concept of filtering, which I studied a lot in the 50s and 60s in terms of housing movement and migration, the idea is that it's traditionally seen as everybody filters up. In other words, we start off not making a lot of money. As we move in our careers, we make more money, we can move up, get a bigger house, live in a better neighborhood. And I don't really study that much about filtering down. But with the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis, that's where you started seeing people like, okay, we're going to start moving down. And what's interesting is that during that time, this housing trend, about 20% moving in any given year, the size of single-family homes that was built, the square footage actually started to shrink. People started building smaller homes. So a decade ago, when they spent a lot of time building McMansions, they started scaling back the size of the homes that they were building. But again, part of it is that it takes a while for the market to reflect or to take that into account in terms of what they actually build. And then the question is, what do you build and where? Any questions so far? Okay. So in terms of housing considerations, again, you all, I'm assuming you know this. I don't know what they teach in the market analysis class, but I sort of pulled in some of the stuff that I taught when I taught market analysis. But you have segmentation. So people will say, well, multifamily versus single family. But within those two, there's so many different types, especially with multifamily, because you're talking about, are you going to build condos, townhomes, row homes, lofts, live, work, cluster homes, where you might have 4 different units and they all share a wall. And then you have to figure out, well, how many rooms are you going to build? How many bathrooms should these have? What kind of parking are you going to have if you have any parking? And what kind of amenities do you have in it? So when I was back in Texas, I visited a development in San Antonio, condos, and they had an espresso unit that was actually built into the counter. So not like one that you would buy, but it was that high end where it was actually an amenity that was standard in all the homes. In terms of how you filled it, it was a little bit funky in terms of But anyway, it wasn't something that you could remove. The other thing they had was one of those really high-end, I don't know if it was sub-zero or even higher end than that, but if the light bulb went out on the fridge, a sensor goes to the company and somebody shows up at your door with a replacement bulb. And I don't know if that's sub-zero or not. They also had an automatic rotisserie thing attachment for the ovens, where you put, let's say you put a whole chicken in there, there's an actual thermometer where when it gets to the right temperature, it will sear the outside of it. So I mean, it was, yeah, and that was just the kitchen, so I was like, that is awesome. Because it took out all the guesswork. But that was an amenity that, again, these homes in San Antonio, one thing I forgot to mention is that the units took the entire floor, so they were sort of linear, but you got to see the sunrise on one end, and you got to see the sunset on the other. So you had these views, and you also had nice views of downtown as well as the rolling hills. So I mean, they did a great job in terms of the placement on the site and everything else. In terms of economic trends, I talked about bigger, smaller, that leading up to the Great Recession, things kept getting bigger and bigger, and then they scaled everything back as a reaction to the Great Recession. People's tastes changed. They realized that, okay, maybe it wasn't a good idea to have a big house because their mortgages left them underwater. Where once the market corrected for real estate prices, they owed more on their homes than the homes were worth once they had that market correction. So basic housing considerations in terms of demand, population, employment, income, and segmentation of each. And again, employment and income are sort of tied together. But what's one of the problems we have in Florida? Actually, I don't know if that's a problem. Part of it is that if I'm an affluent retiree, how much money am I making? Because you might just be coasting off of your investments. So it's sort of difficult to tell because they might be getting Social Security, which is tracked, but then based on dividends and all the other things from their investments, it's very difficult to figure that out. In terms of supply, you can look at things like current residential construction trends. And again, part of this is for that, an inventory and type, prices, sales and construction type in terms of are they selling them or renting them, and amenities. All those are things you can sort of search for online through like LoopNet or other things, or you can just pay to get that information somehow. Like right now I'm doing a study in a very small town in North Florida, North Central Florida. The town has about 7,000 people. That's the largest town in the county.
Is it Mayo?
So what?
Mayo? What is it?
No, it's closer than that. It's, no, I'm not going to say. But no, it's Live Oak.
It's close to Gainesville.
Yeah. So, and when you look up homes for sale, just to get an idea for what's in the market, they're actually seen as being in the Jacksonville metropolitan market. They're at the intersection of 75 and 10. So that's not anywhere near Jacksonville. But anyway, so doing these types of things is a little bit difficult because there's not a lot of action in that market as there is in Miami-Dade County and Broward County. So in areas where you have a lot of development action, there's a lot of data that exists where you can get this type of information.
So are you just looking on LoopNet for that city, or?
I'm looking under rocks.
And what
No, I'm just
what-
kidding. What am I doing?
What's your focus for now?
My focus is coming up with a housing, it's basically a housing study to see how much they can support different housing types for the next like 10 to 20 years.
Okay.
So it's kind of a fun issue because after driving through the town, there are some challenges. Part of it is that based on where the town's located, you don't see a lot of population growth. So the idea is, well, can you grow the population? And they're sort of off the beaten path, which some people would be like, yes, they are, if you've been there. But to some extent, that's exactly what people like. So some of the homes that I was looking at, it was a double-wide mobile home on 10 acres that was wooded and goes up to a river. And I'm like, all right, great looking property, why haven't they built a house on it? And part of it is that if I have a mobile home, it's considered personal property versus real estate property that's taxed by the county.
A lot of agriculture up there too.
Yeah. So in terms of different types of things, and again, I don't know how, they don't teach a class on residential development, do they?
They should.
Do they?
No.
No? Yeah? I'm just gonna go through some types that you might not be familiar with in terms of multifamily. As multifamily, it's a little bit different, and we build a ton of it in Florida because we don't always have a ton of space. So one thing, one option is the concept of courtyard apartments. So they're urban pedestrian oriented, so I mean you could say that they're sort of like a lot of the mixed use stuff that goes up, but it has a little bit of space. So non-residential on the first floor, usually they'll have retail or something like that. If they're really lucky, they might get a small grocery store. Ideally, it's built to the sidewalk edge, and the first floor is usually elevated significantly above the sidewalk in terms of that first level of residential. Parking, you either have it below grade, behind it, inside of it, somewhere. And a lot of times they can be leased as apartments or sold as condos. So when the economy is going really well, they're condos. When the economy is tanking, they're apartments. When the economy turns back around, they go back to condos. Maybe. So we'll see. What do they look like? I've got pictures for all of these. So a courtyard apartment, this is actually for a historic building, but a courtyard apartment, you kind of have this upside down U, like a tuning fork type of thing, but this is all courtyard in the center. So that's all dedicated space for the people specifically that live here. Although usually, here's the street, so there is some access from the street to get into that. And there are a lot of cities where they'll fence that off, so that it becomes a little bit more private for the people that actually live there in terms of preventing access to things like, if they're in an urban area, you have to deal with things like homelessness, drug issues, things along those lines. And here's a lower scale example of a courtyard. And to do something like this down here, you'd have to have a lot of space. There are some subsidized housing or affordable housing that's been built in Miami that was actually originally built like this. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it looks pretty nice, and you wouldn't think that it was an affordable housing development. Then you have loft apartments. How many are familiar with this? Partly because you don't have a lot of old warehouses down here. So they're a lot more prevalent in older cities or in older sections of newer cities. So in other words, Houston, which wouldn't necessarily be considered an older city, a lot of their warehousing space has been turned into loft housing because a lot of people want to live in downtown areas. So in terms of where you see cities that have a resurgence of a residential population in downtown areas, a lot of it is due to taking an old warehouse that might have been dilapidated or vacant for a while and converting it into condos or apartments. In some cases, because you have these big open spaces, they work pretty well as workspace. So people might switch them up and make them live workspace because you can sort of divide it into like rectangles or something like that, where on the back end you have the living space and on the front end you can have the workspace. So it could be an office, or there's a lot of artist lofts that are popping up, like Fat Village on in Sistrunk or just east of Sistrunk. You're starting to see more of these live workspaces for artists.
They're super small.
No, they are small. I agree.
I call it a loft and it's small.
Right. No, I know, because I've looked at them. I mean, not to like live in, but I've been interested in terms of just that neighborhood, in terms of where it's going to go next. Because we're like, oh great, we have all these artists here, but at the same time, it's probably going to gentrify parts of Sistrunk, which,
Pretty much everyone's done.
well, they're getting there. But it's kind of like that other side of the tracks, literally. Once you cross the tracks, it's like you've got the traditional historic neighborhood of Sistrunk, and then on the other side, you've got sort of this artist colony loft type of thing. So we'll see where it goes. And in terms of lofts themselves, a lot of times people refer to them generically, but there are hard lofts and there are soft lofts. So soft lofts, usually they're not the traditional building. They'll have high ceilings, they'll be fully finished and partitioned, but they'll essentially imitate what you would see in a hard loft. So a hard loft, you'll have more of the traditional warehouse look, where the windows won't look like your typical windows, they look more like the factory type windows. So they might be a lot larger, a lot wider. You'll see minimal finish, or it'll be unfinished. You'll see like exposed HVAC systems, things along those lines. And again, all of those things are easy to replicate in a soft loft because you're building it from scratch. You can build it to look like whatever you want to. Whereas with hard lofts, it's usually those things have been exposed, so you just leave them there. So this is essentially what one of these loft live workspaces would look like. So in other words, you have your office or den here, bathroom, living dining area, and the bedroom's back there. So that when somebody enters, they more or less would enter through this door into the living area, and then they'd be in the office or the den. In some other areas, they have these very narrow type of things, like I mentioned, where they'll have the business or whatever it is up front, and the living space is in the back. Let me talk about Maisonette. This is one of the ideas I might try to pitch for Live Oak, maybe. Because they have an older population and they've got a younger population. The older population, you put them in the first floor flat, no steps. And it's small. So how much space do they really need? I'm not saying that elderly people don't need a lot of space. I'm just saying that if it's more or less, you guys familiar with universal design? I feel like I keep like going further and further away. Universal design is this concept where you can build something in a specific way so people can live there for their entire lives as they age over time. And this is a really important concept in Florida because it deals with things like the doorknob. See the lever back there? So because it's a lever, it's easy to put your hand on it and move it down. If it's a knob, and let's say you have something like arthritis, it's very difficult to turn a regular knob. So the idea is, okay, for the code, you'll have people build with that type of knob. And you put shelves, maybe not this high, but maybe all at eye level. And the doors are a little bit wider to accommodate things like a walker or a wheelchair. But it's kind of subtle as opposed to being real obvious. Like, how many of you have ever stayed in a handicap accessible hotel room? Yeah. It's a lot different compared to when you stay in a normal hotel room. The idea with this is that it's a little bit more universal, for lack of a better word, in terms of being able to accommodate somebody who's my age, somebody who's 30 years older than I am, or somebody that's 20 years younger than I am. So the idea behind universal design is that anybody can use it. So that could be one possibility for that flat. The second and third floor is the idea of a townhome. It's like a starter home. So a little bit larger than an apartment, plus you have a second and a third floor. So rather than being just like an apartment all in one area, you could have bedrooms on the second floor, or sorry, on the third floor, maybe a living room, kitchen on the second floor. But there are a variety of ways you can play with these different types of things. And they're very popular in Europe, not so much in the United States. The other nice thing is that each unit has its own street level entrance. And then garage or surface parking either behind it or in front of it. Mansion apartments, anybody familiar with that? Great use for a bed and breakfast because you've got a single entrance, more rooms than you need, and so you can pretty easily turn it into a bed and breakfast. Other things you can do in places like Austin, downtown Austin, they turn a lot of these into law offices or architecture offices or real estate offices. Basically, relationship type of businesses occupy these homes in places like Austin and some other places. In other places, you can actually turn them into apartments. It can be a little bit expensive, especially because you need to knock down some walls. When you knock down walls in historic homes, you come across fun things like asbestos, lead-based paint on the walls. So you start opening that up when you start taking walls out. What else? Toxic mold. You start running into wiring issues and a bunch of other stuff. Oh. What? Well, yeah, there's people because you have to share the space. But there was a serial killer in Cleveland that did
I
that.
know.
Yeah, okay. His name was not Jesse Saginaw. Just want to toss that out. And again, I don't know that many older neighborhoods in Florida that have this type of setup, but they're doing this all through the Northeast, the Midwest, and some other areas of the country. Because the idea is that you have this great architecture. In some cases, they're in historic districts, so you can't really tear them down. So one thing you can do is turn them into, I don't know, condos or apartments.
That's St. Augustine, Florida.
Yeah, actually, St. Augustine might be the only city that I can think of in Florida that has something like this. So you have live-work units. I already talked about these a bunch, right? What do they look like? I like historic stuff, so that's why I pulled in the Tomahawk building. And so, very narrow building up in that top picture. That's what it looks like today. In terms of what the layout looks like for the multifamily stuff, that's what it looks like. So when you come up, you've got this private elevator from the lobby. You've got the kitchen, dining area, home office. You've got a living room, and then you've got one bedroom back here. And so that's how that building, the Tomahawk building, is set up in terms of live-work units. So irrespective of what you build, because I got to talk about Lynch, right? I was getting to it. He doesn't touch on a lot of these things. He just sort of mentions them. So he discusses a bunch of things. And in terms of how to build as it relates to specific sites you're looking at. So one just includes the space itself, in terms of this relationship between what you're building and the amount of space you have to work with. Second is the car. What do you do with it? Third thing is based on facility standards. The fourth thing, density. I'll talk about all these a little bit more in the following slides. The fifth thing, he talks about patterns and modules. The best way I can relate to it is if you look at a development as a puzzle, this module idea would be each piece of that puzzle and how you put it all together. In some cases it could be a repeating pattern, in other cases it could be a bunch of funky shapes. You have things like trailer parks, which I'll talk about, because he actually spends some time at the tail end of this chapter talking about trailer parks. So in terms of the space beyond the building that you're looking at, some things to keep in mind. Think about where you live right now, and all you're going to do is raise your hands for this, right? So, where you live right now, does it have these uses? I know some of you live in homes, some of you, how many of you live in like a single family house? Okay, so that's like roughly half the class. All right. So, how's the pedestrian circulation outside of your house? And if you're not in a house, how is it in an apartment or wherever else you might live? Actually, did I say some raising hands? These are supposed to be like just by show of hands. Whatever. So, by show of hands, how many of you think you have good pedestrian circulation where you live? All right, it's about half the class. What about good vehicle circulation? Okay, about half the class. What about good parking? See, is that all the people that, okay, how many of you don't have good parking and don't live in a single family home? Okay. Because like where I live, I've got great parking. Although because my house was built in 1980, I've got like a garage for 1.5 cars, which I don't quite get. Because I don't have a large car, but I can't fit 2 cars in my garage.
Storage.
Or storage.
Storage.
Yeah, storage. I got storage above the garage too, but. What about spaces to play?
Yes.
Okay. What about a sitting area?
Yeah.
Only one, so you have to share it? Okay. Got it. Disposal facilities?
For garbage?
Yeah, basically. And is that away from the building? Like, can you smell it? Because right now I'm sure it's getting pretty bright. Okay. Well, how many of you have storage? Okay. What about Utilities, any of you have problems with utilities? All your utilities work? No water problems in the multifamily stuff? Good. What about landscape areas? Which isn't really different from sitting areas, but I guess that's areas where you wouldn't sit that are outside. Okay? What about barriers to sight, sound, sun, and wind? All that stuff that Lynch talks about in the first couple of chapters. All right, so there's some trees, some barriers. So Lynch spent some time talking about in the housing chapter having all of these different uses on the site. He spent some time talking about yards. How many of you would call that a yard?
No.
Because what, I mean, it's a space. And again, part of it is that, okay, if you went from living in an apartment with none of your own dedicated space to living in this, that would actually be pretty nice. Right. So, some of the things that Lynch talks about is if you have a 40 by 40 foot space, it's enough to have some play space, a sitting area, and some flowers. Like 40 by 40 is not a lot of space. 20 by 20, that's the minimum area for sitting. So I mean, that's like, let's put it like this. When I board my dog, it's a 5 by 4 square foot area. So that's about a little bit more than what my dog gets boarded in. I mean, 5 by 4, 20 by 20, sure it's a lot larger, but we talk about people versus
Poor
my
dog.
dog. What?
Poor dogs.
Yeah, exactly. I thought you said poor dog, and I was like, oh, he loves it there. That's what I like to think. So I don't feel bad when I drop them off. I call it doggy fight club, but that's something completely different. So one thing you can do is you can vary yards, and by varying yards, you can vary price, all within the same development. So I have some neighbors down the street, and I went in their backyard, and their backyard is huge compared to mine. Part of it is they're sort of at this funky corner area where two streets sort of converge. So they've got a large front yard, but they have a huge backyard. And I said, look, if you guys ever want to get rid of this house, I wouldn't mind buying it, so let me know. And it was funny because he said that, because they're in their early 70s, and he said, well, we're thinking about leaving, but when we move somewhere, we just leave all the stuff behind, so you buy it as is. And I was like, okay, because they have a lot of cat stuff, but they have no cat.
Oh, no.
I guess they used to have a cat, but I was like, that's kind of creepy. Probably, yeah, right behind the wall. I just found the flies after I move in. Anyway, so one of the nice things about something like having a yard is you can have visual privacy in a variety of ways. So you can have a fence or you can have hedges. Like in my backyard, I've got a fence, but then I have a row of ficus trees behind that. So there's some privacy either way. That does not stop raccoons from harassing my dog, like they were doing at about 11:30 last night, because they were noisy. And they were up in the trees, and he could not get them, but he really wanted to.
Where do you live again?
Delray Beach. But my house backs up to a canal, so that's the reason for all the wildlife.
And there's raccoons back there? Wow.
Oh, they were-
I didn't know.
No, these were two babies. So I'm assuming that I don't know their family makeup. I'm assuming that the parents might have been around, but I pulled my dog in because if they were around, they're usually not as friendly and cute as the babies are. Right. Yeah. Then you have things like views and spacing. How do you like that picture?
Great.
How many of you have ever had a view like that?
I have.
Like this reminds me of a hospital view. Because you know how a lot of times hospitals, they're sort of formed as a U and you're like looking at a wall or some other type of nonsense. Actually, the last hotel I stayed in,
I was gonna say that in the Northeast.
yeah, I got a view like that, which was nice, real nice. So if it's too close, you get noise and a variety of other things. If it's too close, you also get limited daylighting. And one thing that Lynch says is, can you see the sky from every window in the house? As sort of a way to weigh it. So in terms of, we don't have to talk about my house. Talk about it plenty enough. But I can essentially see the sky from every window in my house except for the one that has glass block. Just because you can't see through glass block, but I know the sky is there. So how many of you, from every window where you live, can you see the sky from every window? Everyone? Okay. So what about the, what number did I cut out? Is the nearest window to your neighbor, whatever. How close is your window to your neighbor? Is it a little too personal?
No.
Like the nice thing about the way that they built it, it's essentially where my bedroom is, there's a minimal amount of windows on that other house. It's like they have a full wall. And they kind of did that with the entire layout. So there's a little bit more privacy from the windows where the bedroom is, or at least the master bedroom, than there are for other areas in the house. So slab directions, I'm going to be honest. How many of you like talking about concrete slabs? That's right, you're all really excited. I can tell. I can kind of feel it in the air a little bit. But let's just spend some time talking about how if you're in the north and you build east-west, and if you're in the south and you build north-south. Just a couple things to keep in mind. Is that if you're in the north and you build east-west, you don't get sun in the wintertime. So if you do that, wintertime gets really depressing, but it might also get really warm in the summertime. In the south with the north-south axis, you might get too much sun in the summertime. So the idea is, well, you might want to switch that slab up a little bit so that it's kind of northeast, southwest oriented in both cases to try to take advantage of having some optimal sunlighting and daylighting versus not having any at all or too much of it. Then you have the issue of the car. Lynch says, hey, you know what? I don't know where you put the car. There's no best place to put the car. So in terms of what Lynch thinks, anybody know what he thinks about parking? There you go. So Lynch isn't going to say, hey, you should put the car here, you should put the garage here, or in the back, or just have on-street parking, or just whatever. He just says, put it somewhere. And what he does say, though, is that wherever you put it, minimize the fact that it looks like parking. So if you're going to do attached garages, make the garage look like the house, even though everybody knows it's a garage, it has the same theme or something like that. Or if you're going to put it all the way in the back, put it all the way in the back. It'll make the driveway look nice somehow, even though you all know it's a driveway. So in terms of, this is from the American Planning Association, and they have planning and urban design standards. These are their recommendations. The reason why I pull this in is because Lynch is a little bit dated. A lot of the estimates that he uses are also outdated. But in terms of this, in terms of residential housing types and different comparisons, the idea is that more or less where should you put it? Lynch doesn't answer this question, but what they say is that if you're building single-family detached, the garage should be adjacent. If you're building single-family attached, it should be behind the building. Multifamily low-rise, make it adjacent to building, either in a service lot, depending on how many spaces you're talking about, based on the size of the building, or possibly a parking structure of some sort. And then as you go from essentially multifamily low-rise to multifamily high-rise, you're talking about more likely a parking structure within the building or adjacent to the building as opposed to surface parking, based on the fact that you're going to have a ton of people, which means you need a lot more surface space. So more often than not, you'll see a garage getting built. Then he talks about fun things like facility standards. And from pages 142 to 145, I say take his recommendations lightly because he says things like, it takes 4,000 to 5,000 people to support a center of any competitive strength or interest. Now imagine the impact that if we use that standard for retail right now, it would be like a CVS and even more on every single corner than there already are now. Think about how many Starbucks we would have if we used that. So it's really outdated, or it's accurate and we're just heavily over retail. I'll leave that up to everybody else to decide. He'd say 1.25 acres per 1,000 people for playgrounds for 6 to 12-year-olds within half a mile of where they're living. And one interesting thing is that some cities will have this standard as part of their code, because most developers won't necessarily build those things intentionally. Sometimes they will, depending on the size of it, because they know the demographic that they're trying to attract. If they're trying to get families with young kids, they'll be more likely to build a playground without even needing to reference these metrics. Additionally, one thing he sort of leaves out is how large is the neighborhood. Anybody here know how large a neighborhood is? It's like most of us define neighborhoods based on general areas, not like a specific, okay, if you have 5,000 people, that's a neighborhood. Because some neighborhoods, like let's say an area of Miami like Little Havana, they have far more than a couple thousand people. I can't remember what the, is it 25,000? Right, to some extent it depends on the households, housing density, a variety of other things. There need not be any neatly packaged areas single-centered of a magically ideal size. That's Lynch's definition of a neighborhood. Does that work for all of you? So if somebody were to say, how would you define a neighborhood? You say, well, it's not really any neatly packaged areas. It doesn't really have any center. And it's not really of any type of magically ideal size. People would be like, not so sure about you. So that's why we'll move on to modules and patterns. 2 questions to think about here. Everybody ready for these 2 questions? I came with them all myself, mostly. First question is, which pattern makes the most sense? So if you have more or less a blank slate, how are you going to subdivide or build on that development in a way that makes the most sense? Okay? That's sort of the site planning question. The real estate development question is, which pattern makes the most money? So long term, from a real estate development standpoint, what you would be doing is taking these 2 questions and reconciling the answers to figure out how do you maximize 2 based on 1. And so these answers essentially feed into one another. Then he spent some time talking about modules and patterns. And he talks about, what do you have the residential area going right on the street front? Are you talking about rows or units, courtyards? Are you talking about cluster housing? We've got more or less 4 homes that all share a wall. Do you have the units first, or do you have some sort of isolated point, which would technically be your typical single-family development? Then he talks about the house trailer, what we commonly look at as the mobile home. And he says, I'll read this off here. He says trailers, or more grandly, mobile homes. How many of you think of mobile homes as a grand term? Just saying things were a little bit different when Lynch wrote the book. They have many substantial advantages for the small family. They're inexpensive. How many of you agree with that?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen $1 million trailers?
Someone can take that.
Yeah. They can easily be bought and resold. Would you agree with that?
No.
Okay. The buyer knows exactly what they're getting for the price. Would you agree with that? Pretty much just like any other home. I mean, you can't really look under the hood of a home as easily as you can a mobile home, but still it's the same issues. They're compact and easy to maintain. Maybe, maybe not. Depends. What else? Fully equipped, they can follow the family wherever it goes. But this last one is the important one. How many of you would say that it has the glamour of newness? Yeah. So, but that was Lynch's take on it. and we talked about all those issues. We get the idea about trailer parks, right? I'm trying to get to more interesting things in terms of 5 trends to watch related to multifamily housing. And this is from the Urban Land Institute and a couple of other sources. So one is more and more people want to live this urban lifestyle. So for a while there, everybody was moving further and further out, and now they're seeing people are saying, you know what, I really don't want to take care of a yard. I don't really want to have to deal with the issues of home ownership. So they don't mind condo ownership, but there's just no yard. And it's more urban, for lack of a better word, so higher density to some extent. They're looking for affordability, but they still want nice things. So it's just like any other thing related to taxation. Everyone wants to live in a really nice city, but nobody really wants higher taxes that it would cost to pay for all those nice things. Right? How many of you want a luxury car? How many of you want a luxury car for $200 a month? See, so it changes a little bit. One other thing is that if you can do the same type of unit, same size, same amenities within the unit, but the amenities outside of the unit, how do you top whoever your competitors are? Fourth thing is giving tenants more control over technology about what they want to see in their house. From things like appliances to one of those Nest thermostats to a variety of other options in terms of the house. And then the fifth thing is having tenants sign a green lease. So you sign this and you're going to recycle. Maybe if you end up people to sign up, you try to get all solar power and energy for the home. And you try to make it as sustainable as possible, and you do a variety of other things. So those are some trends. How are we on time? We're fine on time. So anybody know what this is right here?
Yeah,
That's
they're
right.
building it in Wynwood.
That's. So you read the Miami Herald too?
I read the South Florida Business Journal.
Okay, yeah, I was in there too. So this is Wynwood 25, and the idea is that this is going to attract a bunch of millennials. They're going to have a bunch of different things there. Mostly it's going to be studio apartments and one-bedroom apartments, and ideally they're all going to sell or rent, sorry, for $2,000 or less a month in the Wynwood district. So you're not talking about a lot of space, but for $2,000 to live in that neighborhood, that's pretty affordable. And what other fun things do they have? It's going to have, okay, 289 rental apartments, collaborative workspaces, so sort of that live-work idea, bike storage, dog washing facilities, and a rooftop pool terrace. So dog washing facilities, space for pets, that's become a lot more important because if people are living in urban areas, and one reason why people might not live in apartments, because a lot of them aren't pet friendly. And now, in the last, I'd say probably decade, 5 to 10 years, people are realizing that, you know what, if they have space for the pets, people will pay more money to live in those facilities. Especially if you're talking about people, older people, that have Fifi, Fluffy, whatever stupid name you want to call their dogs. Hopefully, none of you have a dog here named Fluffy or Fifi, right? No, that's not. So anyway, but having these pet facilities has actually attracted people to those areas. So just for the sake of time, I'm just going to click on this one instead of all these, especially because it's still downloading that. So this is in San Francisco, and this is the lobby of this apartment building. So what do you think of just this lobby? Yeah, fancy, trendy, expensive. So here you can get a nice little, essentially one bedroom. This might even be a studio for the low price of $32.50. That's cheap for San Francisco, though. In terms of features, so the social features, we'll skip the apartment features. Pretty much, although they do have chalkboard walls. So flexible sliding doors and walls to separate living and sleeping spaces. Customizable closets. That's a good question. I might have to Google that.
Well, you know,
Oh, yeah, I think so you can store your bike, like right on the wall,
What's it called?
a gear wall. Like, have you ever been in somebody's garage that has a workshop there, and they have like all the different hooks and stuff like that? Stuff like you'd see at IKEA, or the Container Store, they have these wall systems. I'm pretty sure that's what it refers to. But in terms of social features, this is more important. Well, I'm not saying it's more important, but indoor and outdoor chill spaces. So not outdoor spaces, but chill spaces. They have a lounge, fully equipped do-it-yourself resident workshop space. A 10,000 square foot courtyard with outdoor movie screen, bike storage and bike lobby for residents to repair bikes. Underground parking, a complimentary package acceptance service. So think about this, if you've ever lived in an apartment building, if you're not home and they try to deliver a package, you don't get that package. They're not always willing to leave it because sometimes those packages will get stolen. So in this case, they'll actually have somebody there to accept the package for you. So all that stuff you bought on Amazon Prime Day today, somebody's there to collect it for you. Pet-friendly community with a dog run and pet wash station. On-site retail, directly across from Twitter headquarters in 1 Kings Lane. Artwork from local artists throughout the community. So, that gives you some idea in terms of amenities that you would see.
wait, it's an affordable housing available.
Yeah, 3250 is affordable in San Francisco. When you have bungalow homes in San Francisco that are going for like $1.5 million, and it's 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and it's a single family home, it's like on a postage stamp sized place. Right. So then you have other things, rooftop amenities. Do you guys want to see these? Some of them are a little bit ridiculous. I think this first one is okay, there we go. So this is in Minneapolis. And if you look at it, I mean, again, it's not that much different than a lot of the stuff that we'd see down here. Because there have been some condos that I've been to that have this type of setup on top of it in Fort Lauderdale. And it's pretty nice, but they're trying to sort of have this arm race in terms of not just having a pool there, but having all kinds of stuff. Grilling space, actual lawn to walk your dog on, a variety of other types of uses. So the rooftop, what do you do with the rooftop? It used to be we put all the ventilation, all the other systems there related to HVAC, but now it's like you need to do something with that rooftop because that's a huge selling point with people who don't just want somewhere to live.
So where does that go?
So what?
Where does the HVAC renovations go?
Oh, they still have it elsewhere, but they just kind of mask it a little bit better. So in other words, they'll have it all in one area of the roof to free up as much roof space as possible to do something like this. Because you still need it. All right, so any questions on this before I move on to special types of site plan? All right. So, they talk about typology of shopping centers at all in your other classes? All right. I'll put this online just because it's a lot of, oh, that's right, sorry. Actually downloaded this. So, and here's why I'm going to put it online, because it's real teeny tiny, right? So, if you take a look, it goes from a super regional mall, which on average has 1.2 million square feet, all the way down to things like airport retail, theme festival, factory outlet, lifestyle center, power center. For each one of these, it gives you a definition of the concept, it tells you how many exist in the United States, the entire gross leasable area of all of these, the percentage of the overall industry, gross leasable space, and a bunch of other stuff. But I'll put this online because it's a lot easier to see. It talks about the average size of each one of these, how many acres you would need to build it, how many anchors would anchor the development, and a couple of other things. as well as the trade area size. So I'll put this online after class. So some basic rules of thumb. When we talk about these other types of uses, you have to think about things like parking. So for each gross leasable area related to retail, for each 1,000 square feet, you're talking about 5 to 6.5 spaces. And again, this will vary from city to city. They might have higher expectations or lower expectations of how many parking spaces you need. And on average, it takes about 325 square feet for a compact car, 400 square feet for larger cars. And so again, just from the parking standpoint, if you're required to have a certain number of parking spaces, this cuts into the amount of developable land that you might have on your site. And also when it comes to retail, because you need things like parking, maybe some landscaping, you need some sidewalk or some other space for people to be able to access the retail store, then you have some setbacks and a variety of other things. You're talking about for each acre you have, you might only be able to develop roughly 1/3 of that or less when you account for these other things. Ideally, in terms of how close your parking is to the store, you want it to be 300 to 350 feet. So if you think about retail in downtown areas, it becomes really difficult, although some people don't mind walking in urban areas that are dense. If you need utilities, where are they, and how much would it cost to get networked into those utilities? And really, this isn't so much a problem in South Florida because we're pretty heavily developed. But as you build new stuff further out to the west, you're having to extend a lot of the infrastructure that exists to hook into those utilities. How many of you know what this is? Right, MSRED Park looks pretty nice for the most part. Been relatively functional for a couple of decades. It looks nice, right? For the most part. And it's an example of landscaping because the landscaping at MSRED Park is actually the focal point. It's in the center. You've got everything else around it. So it's kind of nice because that makes it a little bit more unique compared to a lot of the other retail places throughout Florida, where it's always based on the stores or something else, and then the landscaping is sort of thrown in as a secondary thing. So you can use landscaping to balance the site itself in terms of what you're developing. And ideally that could attract people because they'll have concerts at MSRED Park Amphitheater. And so people will mill around before the concert. And so people will go there and they'll meet or they'll have dinner and then they'll hang out before the concert. How many of you have been to a concert at MSRED? Who did you see? It's okay. I'm sure it was really it's in Boca. Oh, nice. Okay. So that attracts people there, but then afterwards, or in terms of taking care of the landscaping, that's a constant thing. Because landscaping, if you don't take care of it, it gets overgrown and it looks really bad. So it's an ongoing expense if you have nice landscaping. Then in terms of flexibility, how much flexibility do you have related to the design in general, but also the layout as things change over time? Because MSRED Park, a lot of things have failed there from they were first there. Like the, I think they had the comic book museum was located there, and that failed miserably very quickly. It's where the IFIC Theater is now. They had a real high-end furniture store there, and that failed partly because people had difficulty accessing it. Or if they bought something, it wasn't easy to put into their car because of parking issues. Yeah. So then there are things like amenities and who's your competition. In terms of perception, there are things like age, the price, quality. Do you need to do a lot of promotions to attract people there, or are people willing to go there on purpose? So in other words, a lot of older malls, especially around the holidays, they'll do different types of things to try to attract more people to the malls. Oh, another issue is security. It's like, I didn't know a lot about Boynton Beach Mall until I asked somebody, because my optometrist, whatever. My insurance said I had to go to JCPenney for my optometrist. And I was like, okay, that's not really where I would want to go to get. But anyway, long story short, I went there and that's when I found out that a bunch of people were killed in the parking lot in some kind of gang fight a while back. Like a decade ago, a lot of gunfire.
In Boca too. Boca Mall too.
Yeah, Boca, pretty much any mall that can happen where you have a bunch of people, when a bunch of people come together, it doesn't always go well. Most days it does. So in terms of industrial sites, whoa, wait, we're so far from done. We're getting close. Now, for some reason it jumped way ahead. I wanted to play this little video, which probably, it might not work because it's still taking.
There are 3 charter schools.
Is it going to make me watch this ad before I can show you the video?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. Okay,
That carry the Lincoln
for the
Martine
next
name.
26 seconds.
Each school serves children in grades K through 8. Enrollment is open in Miami at 970
I'm
West
going to be showing you
Flagler
the
Street,
industrial video behind
in Hialeah
this.
at 3550 West 84th Street, and in Florida City at 147 East Lucy Street, which is Southwest 328th Street.
All right, 5
Lincoln
seconds.
Martine is the school for you.
All right.
From the beginning of time, trade has connected the world. The mega ship era is here, and yes, Port Miami is proud and ready, very ready. The era will bring more trade opportunities for our county, contributing to its future economic growth by increasing trade and generating thousands of more jobs.
And we have to have the vision, and we have to have the fortitude and the political will to make the investments necessary for the future of Miami-Dade County, for the future of our children and our grandchildren, because really that's what it's all about. Creating jobs and opportunity, greater opportunity for them than what we had.
This accomplishment took many years, ladies and gentlemen. It was a lot of hard work. This vessel behind me, the Mo Majesty, is the first Neo-Panamax vessel
All this
to
stuff
call
here is
on
new.
Port Miami's via
To
the
accommodate
expanded
the size of
locks.
that ship.
We are the cruise capital of the world. And today we mark the beginning of maybe being the cargo capital of the world too.
All right, so that's the first mega ship. We'll see if that downloads. In terms of industrial sites, again, a lot of us don't think of industrial being anything fun, but in the right market, it can make a lot of sense, especially if you're in a port. It makes a ton of sense. So I already talked about warehouse and distribution at the front end of this class, that there's a huge demand for this to accommodate these much larger ships that are coming in. Then you also have things like manufacturing and heavy industrial. And again, what do we manufacture in South Florida? Good memories. It's all that tourism. But in terms of what we actually build, sure, there's some small industrial stuff that's built here. But off the top of my head, I don't know of a lot of stuff that's built here. Now, part of it is just, I'm still getting educated about the area. And I know that there's some things that we do. I mean, agriculture is still pretty big in terms of sugar, citrus, and a variety of those types of things. But that's more agricultural as opposed to manufacturing. Then you have refrigeration and cold storage, which we were talking about, I think, before class even started, that again, from a food aspect of a lot of stuff coming into the country, you need to have large cold storage facilities to accommodate more things that are being shipped in. So you're seeing a lot of refrigeration, cold storage popping up in areas throughout Fort Lauderdale, and other buildings, some in Oakland Park, and a couple of other areas. Part of it is because they're trying to build a lot more culinary stuff in the area. Because when people are on vacation, that helps support the restaurant industry. But to get all that food in one area, they're having to build a lot more cold storage facilities, which again, from a real estate development perspective, how much do you want to spend the rest of your lives building cold storage facilities? But there is a market for it. Again, a lot of real estate development, it's not necessarily what anyone would call sexy, but it can still be profitable. Telecom and data hosting centers. Here you're talking about a warehouse that's climate controlled and has nothing but servers. So the concept of server farms, you're talking about the value of a server. Basically, 1 square footage of server space has a value of about $9,000. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you talk about a server that's 12 by 12, you're talking about a lot of money. And then let's say you have a whole facility of those. So from a property value standpoint, or from a capital tax standpoint, you're talking about a very expensive site in terms of what it can hold. So you're starting to see more of these telecom data hosting centers as more and more things move online. In terms of, you know who's got a huge demand for telecom data hosting in South Florida? Cruise line. Because all that stuff is headquartered in Florida. For the most part, they're data centers. Maybe not their country of origin for a variety of tax purposes, but a lot of their data centers are all in South Florida. Then you have things like flex buildings, so warehousing that can be used for a variety of different things. You don't know what you might need it for, so you're talking about largely a large open space that can be subdivided or have a variety of different uses. Then you have things like light industrial, as well as research and development, which could feed into light industrial. So let's say you have research and development space, and something takes off, then you can sort of move it into light industrial. So in some cases, you might be talking about a combination of a flex building with light industrial and research and development within it. So think of it as like an incubator facility. Because if you have the flexible space, as research and development, this becomes profitable, or not profitable, but it becomes viable, you come up with a product. Ideally, you can move it into that light industrial, but having flex space enables you to structure that space as the need arises for your light industrial space related to the outcomes of your research and development. So those three things are sort of chained together. And then the 8th thing are just showroom buildings. Like, I'm looking into some furniture, and I hate the whole process. But from the standpoint of showroom buildings, you're talking about more or less a flex building that's got a specific purpose. So in South Florida, where do we have a lot of showroom buildings? Like right around any place that has water. We've got a lot of yacht facilities. So showrooms for boats, showrooms for cars, so that type of concept where it might all be under one roof. In terms of, and this is the tail end, for those of you that are wondering, there's 6 slides left, which is perfect because I was hoping to wrap up right around now. Some of you were hoping I'd probably wrap up right around an hour or so ago. But you can't play with Legos for 4.5 hours. So, from an institutional use standpoint, what's the best thing about institutional uses? And they attract a huge group of diverse people, regardless of the institutional use. So if you're talking about city offices, or a county courthouse, or a university, or a large school, any of those things, you get a lot of different people that can spin off a lot of things around that. One of the downsides, in terms of what the worst thing about institutional uses are, is that a lot of them don't pay taxes. They're all exempt. So in other words, institutional uses, churches, other religious facilities, tax exempt. They're trying to take away some of that because some of that property is used for non-religious things. So they're trying to flip that a little bit. Universities, most public universities, tax exempt. Schools, tax exempt. Obviously, city and county offices, tax exempt. So one of the biggest issues is, sure, you've got something that could spin off other things, but but they don't generate any property tax revenue for that city. And so that's the downside, but a lot of times people will say, well, if we could just have a branch of Nova located here, then the students that go there, they're gonna eat at the restaurants around the surrounding area. They might live in some of the multifamily or the single-family housing that's in that area. So the idea is that you'll offset that lack of property tax revenue for an increase in revenue, whether it's sales revenue or real estate revenue elsewhere in that economy. So one of the things that Lynch discusses is that most of these institutional uses, they're usually long-lived, they're complex, and they have extensive roles in the community and the surrounding areas that can lead to great richness and character. So if you think about Nova Southeastern and think about the surrounding areas, do you have great richness and character? We're saying based on a drive around, do you see a lot of richness and character? Take any university. We don't have to pick on Nova. Use it as an example. Actually, I got a picture of it coming up. So, but how many of you know what this is? So, this is the University of Virginia. And the plan for it, the original plan, which is essentially this quad here, was done by Thomas Jefferson. So a lot of universities try to do this, but they fall far short based on basically the Oklahoma University. They're set up like this, but the architecture isn't nearly as amazing. But the idea is that, okay, so you have all of your buildings here, you've got your institutional uses essentially bookended by some excellent architecture focal points, and then you've got this quad area for people to more or less congregate, socialize, and all that other stuff. And the idea is that it creates a great sense of community. They say it's complex. I don't quite get that whole complexity idea. But what Lynch would say is that this is a good use in terms of how to set up a university. Because it's got the green spaces and the park spaces and it's pedestrian friendly. If you take a look, all the cars are essentially on the periphery of the entire university. So it's oriented to the pedestrian, not the car.
The University of Michigan is just like that. So it's really cool.
We can't talk about the University of Michigan though, because of my Ohio State, Michigan State pedigree. But yes, you're right. My sister went there. It is really nice, pedestrian friendly. This is at a much smaller scale, but more recent scale. This is Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. I just use it for the same reason because if you take a look, it's pedestrian oriented. But they've got $2 billion of development going on around this university. And part of it has nothing to do with the university. It has to do with the university is right next to 2 hospitals, including the Cleveland Clinic. So you've just got all this stuff going on in this area. What about this one? What? Yeah, that's here. That's here, everybody. We're like in one of these buildings, like this one, right? Okay, yeah. This was that building, and then I got lost here, got lost there. When did we go through there? So I ended up back out here and just drove around to there. So anyway, well, if you take a look, Nova technically is set up to some extent the same way, but the density is completely different than those other universities. The other thing that you notice compared to the other universities is that you can actually see the surface parking all throughout the university. So all the other places, because again they didn't have the land that Nova has, had to do all that stuff in parking garages. When I say all that stuff, that's where all their parking is. So you can't see a lot of surface parking. Anybody know what this is? This is the Graduate College of Princeton University.
Wow.
So I just threw that in as just kind of a cool aspect because you've got these little courtyards that are completely enclosed on the interior. And then, but you still have plenty of green space on the exterior. And then you have this small surface parking. Oh, they have garages everywhere else, or surface parking everywhere else. But in this case, in terms of how it's enclosed, they have multiple little courtyards. I think it's all historic. It's nice. You guys go check it out. It's nice. Okay, so for next class, here's what I'm thinking for next class. Actually, let me ask this question. And then we'll have break, and then we'll play with Legos. All right? How many of you, let's put it like this. The last class, which is 4 weeks from tonight, you guys are going to be presenting your, what's it called? Land use? Urban plan, thank you. Your urban plan outcome. And you're going to be presenting that to me. How many of you want me to also lecture either before you present or after you present that last night of class? By a show of hands, how many of you want to lecture the last night of class after you present for like 3 hours? By a show of hands.
What's the lecture?
Well, the other option is I try to knock it all out in the next class.
Yeah, I'm down with that.
I like that one.
I like that.
Okay, so in other words, one thing is for the next class, it might be slightly more than 2 hours for the lecture because we're talking about 4 chapters, but I'll just kind of do like a Lynch's greatest hits type of thing. So I might not have as many examples, but I'll focus on the important